Good evening, welcome to New Horizons. If you have a mobile phone, if you'd like to put it on sound, please, thank you. Right, massive welcome back to Brian Halliwell with historical tales, myths and stories. Brian takes us back over 2,500 years and examines characters and events from that day, from that time, right up until today. Some strange, some a bit scary. Please welcome Brian Halliwell.
Thank you very much, Rob. Thank you very much. And can I just check that everybody can hear at the back? Yeah. Right, thank you very much. And it is a pleasure to come back. And as I was mentioning it to one or two others before, 10 years has passed, over 10 years has passed since I first came here actually doing talks. I came here about 10 years ago, which was about 2004, maybe 2005, and I did a talk called The Women Pirates. And I think you were here, Rob, that night. I think you were, and Chrissy was here. Yes, John was here. There was only about 12 turned up. The reason being, it was a very foggy night. Nobody could get here. I was lucky to get here, but about 12 hardy souls got here, and that was the first talk I ever did here, The Women Pirates. And then later on I did a talk on the world of synchronicity, which we were just having a chat with one of the chats before, the world of synchronicity. Then we did the Magicians of the Golden Dawn, the life of Aleister Crowley, that we just had a discussion about, good turnouts for that, the Philadelphia experiment, the Mothman. So in other words, over the last 10 years, I've done about 6 talks here. But tonight, really, it's time for something completely different, really. Something completely different, because this talk, the historical tales, myths and stories, really has its origins back in 1994. Because round about 1994, that's when I started studying the ancient world. And I got so keen on the ancient world and ancient history, I finished up taking a degree in it. I got a BA degree, and very proud I was to get it. Hard work, but very proud. In other words, studying the classical world, the Greeks and the Romans. And I don't know whether you know this, but when the Greeks defeated the Persians in the 5th century BC, it just about started our Western civilization. Because if the Greeks hadn't won, our destiny would have been so different. Because the Greeks, they brought us art, democracy, philosophy. We learn a lot from the Greeks and the classical world and the Romans. And believe it or not, we got the joke from the Greeks and Romans. We learnt to laugh at jokes from the Greeks and Romans. That's where we got jokes from, the classical world. And people don't believe this, but we did. We got jokes from the ancient world. We inherited jokes from the classical world. This joke I'm going to mention now, and when people talk about cracking jokes and somebody says, well, that's an old joke, this really is. This joke is 2,500 years old. You are very privileged to listen to it. I'm not saying it's a good joke, it might be a rubbish joke, but it's 2,500 years old, this joke. And it's just like the old jokes that people used to tell about the Englishman, Scotsman and Irishman. It involves a barber, a ballman and a professor who go on a long journey which involves camping overnight. And when the ballman and the professor go to sleep, the barber, just for a bit of a laugh, decides to shave the head of the professor. He has his little machine, he cuts all his hair off, leaves him bald, then for a laugh he gives him a nudge. The professor wakes up, he feels his head, he yawns, he says, you idiot, you've woke up the bald man instead of me. That speaks volumes on what these people used to listen to 2,500 years ago. This second joke I'm going to mention now comes from the oldest joke book in the world. 265 jokes in it. It was written in Greek. I wish I could get my hands on it. I've got a few jokes from it. And it was published around 284 AD, in the 3rd century. Oldest joke book in the world. And many jokes in it. This particular joke is a simple doctor and patient joke. Been doing doctor jokes ever since. When this patient says to his doctor, doctor, when I wake up in the morning and get up, he says, I'm a bit dizzy for about half an hour, then I'm okay. What do you think I should do about it? And the doctor ponders this for a minute and says, well, why don't you just stop in bed another half an hour? Common sense. That's what they used to laugh at in the ancient world. And when we talk about mother-in-law jokes, Les Dawson doing mother-in-law jokes, and I've done talks on Les Dawson over the years. Mother-in-law jokes, you can trace them back to ancient Rome. I have got an old book that I was studying at the time when I was doing the degree from the Roman times, and there's a snippet in that book that mentions a 1st century Roman satirist by the name of Juvenal, who is said to have rocked his audience when he said, "Give up all hopes of peace while your mother-in-law is still alive." That's 2,000 years old. So in other words, we do learn a lot from the Greeks and the Romans. And those are 3 very old jokes, and they literally are old jokes, dragged up from the ancient world. And when we talk about the Greeks and Romans, we do learn a lot. And as I'm sure that we all know and remember, the Romans were here in Britain for about 400 years before we finally got shut of them around about 410 AD. Finally got shut of them. And when you think that a lot of generations of people actually knew nothing else but Roman power. They were born, they died, others were born and died, all they ever knew were Roman power. But eventually we finally got shut of them around about 410 AD. And as I'm sure we can all remember from the old school days, all this started with Julius Caesar. When Julius Caesar came here twice to Britain in 55 and 54 BC, but as I'm sure we can all remember from school, he did not conquer Britain. It's amazing how many people think he did. He came twice in 55 and 54 BC, but he did not conquer Britain. Did not conquer Britain. And just a little fact I wanted to get clear in your minds. But the thing is, Julius Caesar did come twice, he didn't conquer Britain, and I want to dispel another myth about Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar was never a Roman emperor. Amazing how many people think he was. You listen to these documentaries on the television, and sometimes they'll say Julius Caesar, Emperor of Rome. You can read learned articles about Julius Caesar and the ancient Romans, and they'll say Julius Caesar, Emperor of Rome. I go to the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool many times because I love the old paintings. I don't bother driving, I just catch the train from Preston to Liverpool. I get off at Lime Street, I walk across the road, and the Walker Gallery is there. 5 minutes walk across the road, big 3-storey building. I go in and look at all the great paintings. I have a cracking day every time I go. When you go in the Walker Gallery, walk up the steps towards the reception, on the right is a room full of old sculptures from the ancient world. It's worth visiting. There's all these marble sculptures, and there's all these statues, and there's all these busts of the Roman emperors in that room on the right. All the Roman emperors, and on the wall, on the right side, there's a bust of Julius Caesar. And outside it says Julius Caesar, Emperor of Rome. I was staggered when I first saw it. I thought, there's thousands of people coming here, read that, and then think Julius Caesar was an emperor of Rome. And I think next time I go back, I'm going to tell somebody, because otherwise they'll always keep believing that. So when next time I go, I'm going to tell one of the attendants, excuse me, that is wrong. So in other words, Julius Caesar was not an emperor. Julius Caesar had been a dictator for 10 years. Just to remind ourselves from the school days, Julius Caesar was a dictator for 10 years. And he didn't hide the fact that he hated the Republic. He reported to a Senate body. He had a lot of power because he was a powerful general, and he was getting too much power, and this is why he was murdered in 44 BC by the senators. They stabbed him, he was getting too much power, and they got rid of him. And he died in 44 BC. And when Julius Caesar died, lots of people then tried to get the top job. They moved in, all sorts of top generals, wanting to fill his shoes and get the top job. And to cut a very long story short, it basically came down to 2 men. 2 men. Julius Caesar's great nephew, the young 18-year-old Octavius, who was known as Octavian, and Mark Antony. Mark Antony. So these 2 controlled the Roman world. They decided to split the Roman world in 2. Octavian, the young 18-year-old great nephew of Julius Caesar, took the west, and Mark Antony took the east. And as I'm sure, as we all know from school, Mark Antony wanted to carry on his campaigns in the east, and to do this he needed the strength of the Egyptian forces. So he teamed up with Cleopatra, which was his greatest mistake. So in other words, they became an item, as I'm sure we know. Mark Antony and Cleopatra, they finished up having children. But if Cleopatra had come back to Rome with Mark Antony, she would have had a big seat in power in Rome. People didn't want a foreign woman in power. Octavian knew this, so he thought, right, I can get rid of these 2 and get all the power for myself. So the young Octavian waged war on Mark Antony and Cleopatra in the Battle of Actium, just off the coast of Greece in 31 BC, and the result of that was he defeated Mark Antony and Cleopatra. In one swoop, he defeated them. And the result of that was, as I'm sure we all can remember from school, Mark Antony and Cleopatra committed suicide. So this left this young 18-year-old man ruler of the Roman world, and he eventually became Augustus, and he became the first Roman emperor. So in other words, when Julius Caesar was killed, emperors were 13 years away in the future. And I just thought I would mention that and clear up any misgivings about that. The number of people who said to me he was an emperor and he wasn't. 13 years in the future, emperors, when Julius Caesar was killed. Just thought I'd clear that up. So this young 18-year-old lad became master of the Roman world, and he became the first Roman emperor, Augustus, and he ruled for 40 odd years. But we can thank Julius Caesar for one thing. When you study the ancient world here in Britain, and I'm sure some of you might have studied it, you've got to study coin evidence and archaeology, because the ancient Britons did not write anything down. Unlike the Greeks, unlike the Romans, the Egyptians, where you've got plenty of sources, here in Britain, we did not write anything down. So to study the ancient world, you have to study coin evidence and archaeology. I was studying all this because I was trying to discover who was the leaders here in Britain just before and after the Roman occupation, in order to do a talk at a university. I was trying to get the names of the people who ruled here all those years ago. Painstaking task. And it was while I was studying the ancient world here through coins and archaeology, I did make an amazing discovery. I found out the name of a king who ruled here between 95 and 65 BC, here in Britain. The name of a king, and I found it by accident. Does anybody know who that king might be? I just thought, sorry? No, it wasn't. And I just thought I'd mention it because when I was first doing what became a talk about the ancient kings and queens about 12 or 13 years ago, in Billings history, I had a big crowd in that night, and I mentioned about this early king who ruled here between 95 and 65 BC, and I asked that question to the group, massive crowd, to the question to the group, anybody know who the name of that king is who ruled here between 95 and 65 BC? And a little fella at the back put his hand up. And I thought, well, this is good. Somebody in Billings knows his history of Britain. I said, you know who that king is who ruled here between 95 and 65 BC? He says, yes, I do. I said, who was it? He said, old King Cole. Everywhere you go, you get a comedian. You get a comedian. And I said, it's a true story, so I said to him, I said, well, actually, old King Cole was a close contender for the job, but because he was looked on as a merry old soul, and a merry old soul was he, they decided he wasn't taking the job seriously enough, so they give it somebody else instead. And that somebody else was a man called King Diviciacus. I'll say that name again. King Diviciacus. Took me years to find it, and you've got it already. Already you've learnt some important information. When anybody talks about ancient kings, you can say, King Diviciacus ruled here between 95 and 65 BC, somewhere around that time. King Diviciacus. And we know his name because Julius Caesar told us. In his war commentaries, which was a series of 7 books, he wrote and published around 46 BC. I was studying these books to try to find these important names. And by accident, I just found this name in book 4. It started me off. Book 4, only about 3 lines, which you can easily miss. And I spotted it. And it said, a Gallic ruler ruled here in Britain as well as in his homeland. People remember him as warlord, King Diviciacus. So there it was, that name, after I'd been searching for ages, and I found that name, and that started it off. And then for about 10 years, I pieced it all together in what became the kings and queens talk about these early rulers. But I found that name out, and that started it all off. King Diviciacus. And once you've heard that name about 3 times, you never forget it. You've got it now forever. It's up there, and I'm sure you won't forget it. King Diviciacus. And those books that Julius Caesar wrote, those 7 books, his war campaigns, was the Gallic Wars. All about his campaigns in Gaul round about 57 BC and his conquest of the Gauls. And then, as we said before, then he turned his attention to Britain, and he came to Britain in 55 and 54 BC, but he did not conquer Britain. Various reasons why he didn't, but he didn't conquer Britain, and we'll not go into that. He didn't conquer Britain, and when Julius Caesar left, it was 97 years before another Roman force came here. And that was 43 AD with Claudius. Claudius came here, and as a matter of interest, they came here in 43 AD, the Romans, with the biggest invasion force ever to set foot on these islands. Ever set the biggest invasion force. 4 legions of 5,000 men, that's 20,000 crack troops, 20,000 auxiliary soldiers, 40,000 in total. There was 10,000 baggage animals, 900 ships. A logistical nightmare for the Romans. Heaven knows what the tribes in southern Britain thought when they saw this massive invasion force coming here to Britain. And as we said before, the Romans were here for 400 years before we finally got shut of them around about 410 AD. So the point of this little section that we've talked about here is that Julius Caesar was not an emperor of Rome. In other words, so it's good to sort out fact from fiction. It's good to sort out and get to the truth of certain things, because we hear all these stories. Another example that's come down to us, Devil's Island. We're all familiar with that term, Devil's Island. The island that lies off the coast of South America, just off the northeast coast of Guyana. I have sailed past Devil's Island, that little island that lies off the northeast coast of South America. Devil's Island, that name, it just conjured up an image of a penal colony that housed some of the worst and most violent criminals known to mankind. That name, Devil's Island, just about conjured up images of evil-smelling swamps, sadistic guards and harsh punishments. And we have these images because of books and because of films. Ever since Lionel Barrymore, the Hollywood actor, escaped from Devil's Island and trudged through the swamps in that 1936 film, The Devil Doll, others have made films about Devil's Island Prison. Has anybody ever seen that film, Devil Doll, 1936? Very rarely on. I saw it with my mum and dad when I was a little lad. It's on very rarely. All I can say is if it's ever on, The Devil Doll with Lionel Barrymore, watch that film about the Devil's Island Prison. The famous prison, Devil's Island, fostered other films starring the likes of Boris Karloff, Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart, Steve McQueen in Papillon. Has anybody seen Papillon? Yeah. Everybody must have seen that film. Used to be on every Christmas. Steve McQueen, Papillon. That film showed us the horrors of the Devil's Island Prison, did it not? Yeah. That showed us the horrors, how horrible it was. But when we watch films like that or read any books, we should always ask the question, is it fact or is it fiction? Is that what it was really like? Because in truth, the image that's come down to us about Devil's Island is a false one. The opposite is true. Devil's Island, this notorious prison, was more of a paradise than a prison. This island that lies off the northeast coast of South America had been a prison since about 1856 to about 1942. It was open almost 100 years. And it got its name Devil's Island not because of the conditions in the prison, but because of the vicious currents surrounding the island. And the island was only very small, about 1 square mile in area, so logistics shows it only ever held a few prisoners at any one time. In fact, it only ever held about 12. And brutal guards, sadistic guards like it shows in the film, there weren't any brutal guards, because the best security on the island was the vicious currents surrounding the island, and the sea was shark infested. The conditions in the prison was more than reasonable. Each prisoner had his own cabin and his own possessions. He had a little vegetable plot so he could dig and plant and grow his own food. And when a prisoner sat down to his evening meal, he was allowed a glass of wine. They could go for walks round the island whenever they wanted. Sunday strolls were regular. The prisoners were given fishing tackle to while away the hours. They had regular mail and regular health checks. In other words, they had a reasonable life, if not a good life. And I know that some of you were thinking, he's having us on. When I did this talk in Liverpool, 10 years ago, whenever it was, everybody were roaring with laughter. They thought I was pulling the leg. They thought I were having them on. Everything I'm telling you is true. These prisoners had a reasonable life, if not a good life. The only thing they lacked was freedom. So what prompted such lavish attention? The secret of Devil's Island, the prison, is in the type of prison it was. It was a political prison. And it only ever held political prisoners. Like an Alfred Dreyfus, who was a French Jewish army officer who was stitched up by his own high command on charges of treason and espionage. And governments knew only too well that today's villains might be tomorrow's heroes. So the golden rule was, don't make any martyrs, keep the men healthy, feed them up just in case. So what of Henry Charrier, Papillon? He was nothing but a thief and a pimp. Why should the government pamper such a man? The people associated with the Devil's Island prison, the people who used to work there at the Devil's Island prison don't remember anybody called Henry Charrier being on Devil's Island. Nobody ever remembers anybody called Papillon. And when you saw Steve McQueen jump off the cliffs with the 2 barrels under his arm to float away in the shark-infested sea, nobody ever remembers anybody jumping off a cliff with barrels tied under their arm. In fact, there are no recorded escapes on Devil's Island, because once prisoners got to Devil's Island, they didn't want to leave, because they had a better life in that prison on the island than they would have back home as some petty criminal in some hovel. And the weather was fantastic. It was hot and sunny all the time. So once these prisoners got to Devil's Island, it was like living on their own island. Hot and sunny, nice and cushy. They never wanted, so there were no recorded escapes. But with a name like Devil's Island, the imagination runs riot to what might have been. In other words, there is money to be made in the alternative view of fantasy and horror. Create another image and you can make money. In other words, you want to watch a feature film about an ordinary prison. But Devil's Island, the imagination runs riot. Oh, we can watch a great film here, and there's money to be made in fantasy and horror. That is the secret. So in other words, books and films are not necessarily there to educate, they're there to entertain sometimes. So when we all saw Steve McQueen in solitary confinement, remember that? When he's, for some misdemeanor, he's sentenced to solitary confinement. And you see Steve McQueen on his hands and knees, scratching around the prison floor. He's not been fed, so he's haggard and gaunt. Remember that? His teeth are falling out because he's not fed proper. And he's crawling along the prison floor looking for cockroaches, so he can squeeze the cockroaches up into his mug of water to make insect soup. Do you remember that? When he's breaking the cockroaches up into his water so he can drink insect soup. We should have seen Steve McQueen sitting down to roast beef and 2 veg, washed down with a glass of red wine. That's what we should have really seen. But you see, that was the film, but that's what we should have really seen. So in other words, you've always got to ask, is it fact or is it fiction? Even now, I've had discussions in pubs about Devil's Island. I hear people say, Devil's Island, harsh, horrible prison, because we saw the film Papillon. We now know the truth now, don't we? Because we know the secret of Devil's Island. It was nothing of the sort. So it's good to find out the facts and figures and all the rest of it and sift out the truth. I love doing that, finding out the truth, what's fact and what's fiction. But even though I like to sort out things like that, doing research, finding out what's true and what isn't, we still need entertainment. We still need fantasy and horror. We need that because we need escapism from real life. So we need the films. So we need entertainment, we need films, and we need TV. So even though we want to find out the truth, it's good to be entertained with all what we get on the cinema. And that's another area you can speculate about. Films and television. I just want to talk about films and television for a few minutes, for a specific reason. In 1939, a reporter writing for the New York Times was writing about the new invention of television. And he wrote in 1939 in the New York Times, this bloke said, the problem with this new invention, television, people will have to sit with their eyes glued to a small screen for long periods. The average American family haven't time for it, and the average American family won't stand for it. Or no? And the rest, as we say, is history. What a massive understatement that turned out to be, because now it is multi-million-pound industry, 24-hour television, and that reporter said that television won't catch on. I bet he lived to eat his words. I bet he took some stick. Television won't catch on. Multi-million-pound industry now. Multi-million-pound. A far cry when I think of films and TV when I was just a little lad in the 50s watching all these simple programs. And when I was a little lad, I had a funny habit. In fact, I had a few funny habits. One of them was trying to spot the errors in films. Spot the errors in films and all the mistakes, because they were all simple programs then. And I used to try to spot the errors in films and television programs. I used to log it down in an exercise book. And every time there was a film on the television, I said to my dad, there's another mistake in here. He'd say, shut up, Brian, you're ruining the programs. And I've no doubt I was. And I used to think there was only me doing it. I have come to know over the years there were lots more people doing this, finding out the mistakes. And I used to jot all these down. And I have jotted a few down. And I'm going to mention, I have a book full. I'm going to mention a few just to see whether you were as observant as me in spotting these mistakes. I'm just going to give you a few now that are there in these films. And I've no doubt you'll say, oh, what about? Remember that film, 1 Million Years BC? Raquel Welch? Do you remember it? Yeah. I saw it on the pictures. It was on all the week on the television. The Stone Age, prehistoric times. Raquel Welch is the big star. Raquel Welch and all the cave girls are wearing false eyelashes and makeup. 1 million years BC? It's in there. Nobody ever spots that and nobody ever thinks about it. A film called Camelot. Remember that one? Richard Harris. Big musical, Camelot. It's about King Arthur. So it's set round about what? AD 500? AD 550? It's a cracking film, big musical. Richard Harris, King Arthur with his big crown on. And he has to keep singing these songs. And in one of the scenes, he's singing a song and he has to stretch himself to reach the top note. And as he stretches, he can see a plaster on his neck. A Band-Aid? A Band-Aid in AD 500? There's another film that's often on, and I watch it because I love it. 1940-odd film, Lady Hamilton. Nelson. Emma Hamilton and Nelson. Laurence Olivier, Vivian Leigh. I love watching that film. In other words, Trafalgar, 1800 odd, 1805. Cracking film, Laurence Olivier, Vivian Leigh. And there's one little loving moment when Laurence Olivier, as Nelson, is kissing Emma Hamilton goodbye as he goes back to sea. And as he's kissing Emma Hamilton in this little romantic scene, you can clearly hear the sounds of Big Ben 50 years before it was built. It's in that film. Not many people spot it, but it's there. It's there. One of my favourite films, Mysterious Island, that I went to the pictures to see around about 1961. Jules Verne story. Has anybody ever seen it? Yeah. Have you seen it? Is it a good film? Okay. Cracking film. Mysterious Island. The opening scenes of the film, set in 1860-odd, American Civil War, 1860-odd. The opening scenes of the film, very, very gripping. Set in like this federal prison. Thundering and lightning, howling down with wind and rain, a real big stormy night. Michael Craig, the English actor, good-looking lad, he's in prison with all his mates, and he stood at the prison gates because he's waiting to break out. And all the guards are walking up and down in the pouring rain and the goading Michael Craig. And you know he's going to try to escape. And anyhow, one of the prison guards gets a bit too close. Michael Craig grabs him round the neck, throttles him, gets the key from his belt, unlocks the prison door, opens the door, and they all pile out. Michael Craig and all his mates, they run across the prison yard. By now, the guards are alerted. They start firing the rifles, and they kill half a dozen of these, kill some of the men. In the prison yard is a hot air balloon. Remember that? A hot air balloon, moving and swaying in the breeze. In all this thunder and lightning and the rain. Michael Craig and half a dozen of these men, they run to the balloon because they're going to make an escape. They dive into the balloon, they cut the ropes, and they finally make their escape, and the balloon floats up over the buildings, and as it floats up over the buildings, you can clearly see the television aerials on the roofs. 1860 odd. I know that television was an early invention, but was it that early? 80, you can clearly see him. Every time that film's on, I watch for it every time. Another film I like watching, Alfred Hitchcock films. North by Northwest. It's on all the time on Turner Classic Movies. Cary Grant, Eva Marie Saint. Has anybody ever seen it? Good film, innit? Alfred Hitchcock, can't beat it. Cracking film. There's one scene in that film where Eva Marie Saint has to shoot Cary Grant with this gun, has to shoot Cary Grant. The little boy who's in the scene was very, very keen in rehearsals to make sure he got it right. In the actual scene, that little boy puts his fingers in his ears before she picks up the gun to shoot Cary Grant. You've got to think about it. In other words, he knew what he was doing. He was making sure he got his part right. So in other words, you know what's coming, you don't get it, do you? Anyway, if you do, okay, but that's a little mistake in that film. Cracker, I watch for it every time. Another one of my favourite films, North to Alaska. John Wayne, Stuart Granger, gold prospecting in Alaska. Yes. I watch it all the time. It was on the other Sunday. It's a cracking adventure film. John Wayne, Stuart Granger. And they have a big fist fight over this woman. A massive fight. John Wayne and Stuart Granger having this big fight. And during the fight, John Wayne's hairpiece falls off, and then he puts it back on again. You've got to be quick to spot that one. Halfway through the fight, John Wayne's hair falls off, and he puts it back on again. And you've got to be quick to spot that. John Wayne came over here to Britain, and he did a series of interviews. He went round the universities, and an interviewer asked him the delicate question about his hair not being real. And John Wayne said, "Not real? Of course it's real. It's not mine, but it's real." What an answer. What an answer. Good old John Wayne. Good old... Do you remember the Vikings?
Curtis.
Tony Curtis, Kirk Douglas, Ernest Borgnine. There's another film called The Viking Queen, which I'm going to mention in a minute. But that's the most famous one, The Vikings. Ernest Borgnine as Ragnar, the Viking. Kirk Douglas, Tony Curtis, cracking film. The Wrath of the Norsemen. Just as a matter of interest, in the opening scenes in that film, when the longships are coming down the Norwegian fords, and Ragnar's on the front with his sword, he's on the front coming down the Norwegian fords, that scene was filmed in the Bristol Channel. I just thought I'd mention it. But the one I really want to talk about, The Viking Queen, very rarely on. Richard Widmark is in that one. These Vikings come over the North Sea and they land on the coast of Northumberland. All the Vikings, they get out of the longships, they pile in and they run towards this village. They're going to raid this village. The villagers know that the Vikings are coming, and there's a family cowering in this hut. And all of a sudden the door flies open, there's this big Viking stood in the doorway. He's got his big horned helmet on, a big bushy beard. He comes over to him, he raises his axe to kill him, and as he raises his axe to kill him, he's still got his watch on. He forgot to take his watch off when he got changed into his Viking outfit. That is there in that film. When you talk about Tony Curtis, megastar that he was, he made a film before he was really famous. A film, and it was set in the old medieval times. I think he likes to forget this one. He became a big superstar. But in this film, it's set during the 1500s, and it's about these invading armies coming over to attack this little village. And Tony Curtis is the lookout. And he's on the hill looking out for this invading army, and he's got to report back to the village when it's coming. Anyhow, he sees this invading army coming over the hill, so he runs back to the village and he shouts, "Father, father, the 100 Years' War has just started." Oh, well, I'll wait for the penny to drop. Sooner or later it'll drop. I think Tony Curtis would like to forget that one because he became a superstar. And even now in films, you can still spot the mistakes, but it's even more difficult now because it's multi-million-pound, super special effects and all the rest of it. But you can still spot them. They are still there, these mistakes, but much more harder now. A far cry from when I was just a little lad, as I mentioned before, watching all the television programmes. And my favourite television programmes, when I was in the 50s as a little lad, was all the westerns. I used to watch all the cowboy and Indian films because I used to like watching Roy Rogers. Some of you might remember that. I used to like watching Lone Ranger, Hopalong Cassidy, Laramie, Wagon Train. Remember Wagon Train? All these great programmes. And when I was a little lad, my mother used to buy me cowboy comics. And I used to love the cowboy comics all the time. She bought me comics on Kit Carson, one of the folk heroes of the West. I watched a documentary about him not long since. The true story of Kit Carson, totally different than the image that we've got. And I used to read about Buffalo Bill. I used to get Christmas annuals about Buffalo Bill, and another one that I used to be enthralled with, the Pony Express. All familiar with that, the Pony Express? I used to get the comics, the Christmas annuals, watch all the old films on the telly with Randolph Scott, people like that. And the Pony Express used to fire my imagination. And I want to look at that as well, another speculation on the Pony Express. I want to talk about the Pony Express for a minute. I mean, that just about conjured up images of the Wild West, way out west. Daring-do riders going hell for leather across the American plain, ducking and diving and dodging the Indians to deliver all those messages to all those people. But when you look at the Pony Express in detail for what it actually was, the Pony Express was formed in 1860 and it consisted of what is known as relay riders. It was known as the galloping service, but it consisted of what is known as relay riders. And the first rider, loaded down with mail on his horse, used to ride out of St. Joseph in Missouri, calling at various places en route to Sacramento in California. Each rider covered 100 miles and then handed over his mail sack to the next rider. The journey took 10 days and covered 2,000 miles. What I never realised when I was reading these rip-roaring adventure stories in the comics and the Christmas annuals and watching the old films on the television with people like Randolph Scott, what I never realised when I was reading these stories, that one of the pioneer riders of the Pony Express was a bloke from Preston, just down the road. A bloke from the northwest here was one of the pioneer riders of the Pony Express. And nobody ever realises that. A bloke who lived in Preston was a pioneer rider of the Pony Express. And his route to the Wild West started 20 years before, in 1840, when Brigham Young, the Mormon missionary, came over to Preston looking for new recruits into the Mormon faith. And Brigham Young came to Preston in 1840. He stayed about 2 weeks. And then he left and left it to his other people. And the Dobsons of Preston were converted to the Mormon faith alongside a lot of other families from the Penwitham area of Preston. And I've only just found out recently that Mitt Romney, remember Mitt Romney, that big tall American who was going for presidency, he was going for the president's job against Obama, that big tall fella with a black hair, the Mormon, Mitt Romney. I've only just found out recently that he's descended from those Penwitham families in 1840. I never knew that. And once these families had been converted to the Mormon faith, they got baptised down at Avon Park in the River Ribble, which is all still there, down at Old Tram Bridge. And once they became baptised as Mormons, then their future lay way out west, over in America. And those first Preston families moved over to Wyoming as the first destination, before then moving overland, joining a wagon train, going over to the new capital, Mormon capital, Salt Lake City. The only problem for the Dobsons from Preston was they were poverty-stricken, and they couldn't afford a covered wagon. The only thing they could afford was an old handcart to put all their belongings on, and they wanted to trail that cart behind the wagon train to go all the way to Salt Lake City. So they asked the wagon master, and I've always wondered whether it was Ward Bond. Does anybody remember Wagon Train? Yeah. How many people remember Wagon Train? What a great show. Ward Bond, the wagon master. Does anybody remember Flint McCullough? Yeah. Robert Horton. He was the Indian scout. Good-looking fella, Flint McCullough. I remember when I used to watch Wagon Train, when he suddenly left. Robert Horton, as Flint McCullough, he left Wagon Train to go into musical theatre. He spent all his life singing in top shows and cabaret around the world, did Robert Horton, who used to be Flint McCullough. He started at the London Palladium, and I remember seeing that as a singer, and he's still going and he's still performing. He's 89 years old. 89 years old, Robert Horton as Flint McCullough. He was replaced in Wagon Train by Robert Fuller, who played Cooper Smith, another Indian scout. He's still going as well. He's about 80, still acting and still performing. But Ward Bond, the wagon master, was one of my favourites. But he suddenly dropped dead in 1960 of a heart attack. He was only 57. He was one of my favourite actors, was Ward Bond. I love watching all his films. But he suddenly dropped dead in 1960. He was only 57. Bad heart had Ward Bond. And he was replaced by John McIntyre. John McIntyre was a great actor, did a great job in Wagon Train, but I always preferred Ward Bond. Always preferred Ward Bond. But the thing was, the Dobsons wanted this little old wagon that they put all their belongings on, and to trail behind the wagon train that was actually run by Brigham Young. He led the wagon train, not Ward Bond. And he had to basically, the Dobsons had to basically carry that barrow and walk all the way across the American plain behind that wagon train to get to the new Mormon capital, Salt Lake City. What a journey. Walking it took months. What a task that was. And I've always wondered and thought, all this came about due to the new Mormon faith that, as I'm sure some of us know, was started by Joseph Smith from Vermont, who Joseph Smith always said in 1823 he had this vision of an angel that was called Moroni, and this angel told Joseph Smith to go and find this set of golden plates that was buried in a hillside in New York State, and that when he found these golden plates with all these inscriptions on, he had to keep them hidden for 4 years. Joseph Smith went along and dug for these plates, and he found them in this hillside in New York State, found them and brought them back, and apparently he showed them to 11 people to prove that they existed. these sets of golden plates with all these ancient transcriptions on, and 11 people claimed that they saw these plates. After 4 years, Joseph Smith then, he translated those plates into what became the Book of Mormon and published it in 1830, when Joseph Smith was only 24. What a task for a 24-year-old to translate all those gold tablets into what became the Book of Mormon. A mammoth task. Got to admire him for that. But 14 years later, Joseph Smith, he was shot dead. He was killed when he was running for president, and he was only about 38. But Brigham Young, he was the main man after Joseph Smith, and he was also from Vermont, and he became a Mormon in 1832. And he was the mastermind behind the mission to Britain to look for new converts. And the first contingent of Mormons came over in 1837 to Liverpool, and then they swiftly moved on to Preston in 1837. And the reason they came to Preston, I mean, the leader of that group was a man called Heber Kimball, but one of the group had a relative in Preston, and that's why they came to Preston in 1837. And there was 9 people converted to the Mormon faith. That year, 1837, 9 people converted to the Mormon faith, and when they got baptised down at Avenham Park in Preston, 7,000 people came to watch. It must have been like a football match. 7,000 people came to watch those 9 people become Mormons. And little did they realise in 1837 they were making history, because those first 9 people to be converted to Mormons were the first people to be converted by the American missionaries into the Mormon faith, and who would take part in the biggest wagon train trek going across land looking for the promised land. The first converts, and Brigham Young would lead that wagon train. He came over, as we said, in 1840 to Preston, and he converted the Dobsons, various other families, and he also claimed, Brigham Young, that he converted over 9,000 Britons to the Mormon faith. Brigham Young claimed he converted 9,000 people to the Mormon faith. Unbelievable, unbelievable. But back in America, the Mormons, due to one reason or another, had to find somewhere to live. They were being hounded by all sorts of people. So this is why they made that massive wagon train trek right across America to find new land to set up base, basically. And that wagon train, every family had to get a wagon, a covered wagon, and prepare for that journey, which started in Illinois in 1846. And eventually they got to what became Salt Lake City in 1847. What a nightmare journey that was. 15,000 men, women and children made that trek, 1,500 miles. A nightmare journey. Lots of people died. It was over through the mountains, bad weather. People starved, Indian territory. It was a nightmare journey. It was Brigham Young, the force of his personality, that forced them on to the promised land. Even the wagon trains that went across land had the Indian scouts, just like at Flint McCullough in Wagon Train. They had Indian scouts to get them through the mountainous territory. One of the main scouts at the time, in those times, leading the wagon trains, was a man called Jim Bridger. Has anybody ever heard of Jim Bridger? You can't beat all this knowledge, can you? You can't beat. Jim Bridger was an amazing man. He was a mountain man, and he discovered the Great Salt Lake Valley. He discovered it in the 1820s. Jim Bridger roamed the mountain passes for years. He couldn't read or write, yet he could speak 11 languages. Jim Bridger could speak French and 10 Indian languages, because he lived with the Indians. The Indians accepted him, and he even had 3 Indian wives, did Jim Bridger, and this is why he could speak all these languages. And he was one of these people that helped the wagon trains to go across overland. It was a massive task led by Brigham Young. It was an exodus across the desert, just like an exodus in the desert. Brigham Young was called the Lion of the Lord, Brother Brigham, Mormon Moses. I don't know to this day how Brigham Young had the strength to do it. He had 23 recorded wives and 49 children. How did he have the strength to do that and also get that wagon train across to Salt Lake City? Wow. 23 wives and 49 children. What a man he was. What a man. Pardon? What a man. He died in the 1870s of a ruptured appendix. I'm not surprised. I am not surprised. And he was about 70 odd. But when the Pony Express service started in 1860, It started, the Pony Express company started with 500 ponies and 200 riders. And the riders who were recruited were not allowed to swear and not allowed to gamble. Each Pony Express rider was issued with a Bible, a rifle and a shotgun. And the Pony Express company wanted good recruits. So Mormons were ideal candidates because they didn't drink, they didn't gamble. Ideal candidates to sign on as Pony Express riders. And Salt Lake City was slap bang in the middle of the Pony Express route. So in other words, Mormons were ideal. Thomas Dobson from Preston signed on at 19 on $50 a month alongside Buffalo Bill. And Thomas Dobson and Buffalo Bill had some of the roughest territory to travel through. Mountainous regions, all weathers, Indian territory. Do you know, there's a story about the Pony Express. A Pony Express rider rode into a relay station on his horse, dead in the saddle, still clutching and protecting his mailbag, and his back was full of Indian arrows. His back was full of Indian arrows. I was talking to a lady in Liverpool at the museum when I first did this talk many years ago, and she said there used to be a poster up in the museum from 1860 advertising for Pony Express riders, and it said orphans preferred. Orphans preferred. It was that dangerous. But this magnificent service, the Pony Express, that was formed in 1860, collapsed in 1861 due to the telegraph system that came in. So new technology defeated it. So in other words, they were all redundant because the telegraph system came in, so you could then send messages right across America. So in other words, the Pony Express service that you can read about in comics and Christmas annuals, in books, watch all the films. Randolph Scott, I watched one the other week, 1950s film with Charlton Heston, Pony Express rider. The films and the books and the Pony Express service only lasted 18 months. People think it lasted years. It only lasted 18 months. And then it vanished into folklore and history. And vanished. The Great Pony Express lasted 18 months. Simple as that. 18 months. Thomas Dobson then lived a life as a Mormon. And then he died in 1916. He was about 79. So we should always spare a thought when we read books and watch these films about these people in the Pony Express. Spare a thought for the Preston fella who was a pioneer rider of the Pony Express. We should never forget people like Thomas Dobson. We'll have a break now for a cup of tea. That just about finishes the first spot. We'll have a short break, fill up our cups, and then we'll come on again and round off and try to get finished for about 10 to 10. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, we finished up talking about the Pony Express and good old Thomas Dobson from just down the road. So in other words, these are the things to remember when we read books and see these films, that we've had some great people linked here to the Northwest. So Thomas Dobson, who nobody's ever heard of, was a pioneer rider in the Pony Express along with Buffalo Bill. So in other words, these are the great people. And when you talk about the Northwest here, there's lots and lots of important people lived here, either visited the Northwest, passed through the Northwest or whatever. And the man that I'm thinking about now that was linked to that much discussed subject, crime and punishment. And when you study history and talk about history and you talk about changes in history, you see a lot of changes in that subject of crime and punishment. And you now get people who say, well, we live in a crime-ridden society. Well, yes, we do, but there's nothing new. We've always had a crime-ridden society. The only difference now is that punishments are a lot more lenient than they used to be in the old days. And governments have been criticised for it. You get people who say we live in a lawless society and we should have a punishment to fit the crime. As it says in that great show, The Mikado, great song that. The punishment to fit the crime, and maybe we should. But in other words, we couldn't be considered of being too lenient in the old days. But what I've noticed as a student of history and studying history, no matter how severe the punishments and executions were in the old days, you've always had a wrongdoer. You've always had a criminal who will risk the horrible punishments to do his nasty deed in whatever. And here in Britain, like all around the world, in every town, village and hamlet, there's always been a wrongdoer. Always been a wrongdoer, a ne'er-do-well to commit some sort of crime, no matter what the punishment. And if you committed the ultimate crime here in Britain, well, you were regularly dispatched by the Preston hangman, Albert Pierpoint. And what a notorious career he had. We're all familiar with Albert Pierpoint? Yes. the executioner who followed his father into that role as executioner. And Albert Pierpoint, he dispatched over 430 odd people, did Albert Pierpoint, which included Derek Bentley in 1953, who apparently shot a policeman, and he was hanged for it, and Pierpoint hanged him, and his family, Bentley's family, campaigned for years saying that he didn't do it, he should never have been hanged, and in 1998, Bentley was cleared. Even though he'd been hanged in 1953, he was cleared. And of course, Albert Pierpoint, he hanged the last woman to be hanged, Ruth Ellis, in 1955, when she killed her boyfriend. So in other words, Albert Pierpoint was the executioner. And his life story is a brilliant story to read anyway. Otherwise known as the pub landlord, because Albert Pierpoint, he had a pub on the Southport Road, didn't he? He had a pub on the Southport Road, and he ran that pub for years. And Albert Pierpoint, he used to have a hangman's noose behind the bar, just in case of troublemakers. Just in case you had to string one up at the end of the night. So he had that for years. But even, I'm thinking of somebody before him, really, because when you think that years before that, I mean, they couldn't really be considered being too lenient, not like they are now, because in the old days, you could have your hand cut off for stealing a loaf of bread, you could be boiled, burned and beheaded. And if you were hanged instead of suffering that horrible punishment, if you were hanged instead, you were fortunate. And who was there to do the hanging a few hundred years ago? Any offers? Who was the main hangman a few hundred years ago? Any offers? I am talking about, sorry?
Local sheriff.
I am talking about Judge Jeffreys. Judge Jeffreys, the Lord Chief Justice of England, who conducted the assizes, the bloody assizes, during the reign of Charles II. He was known as the hanging judge, was Judge Jeffreys. Oh, he didn't mess about. Everybody lived in fear of Judge Jeffreys. All the country lived in fear of Judge Jeffreys. But Preston, just down the road, didn't. They loved Judge Jeffreys. And the reason they loved Judge Jeffreys in Preston, just down the road, is because he once did a great favour for Preston. He once did a favour. Judge Jeffreys was a regular visitor to the northwest when he came up from the south to preside over the courts in Lancaster. So he'd come up the north and he'd stop at Preston. He'd stop in the Bull Hotel in Preston, which is still there, the Bull and Royal. He'd stop in Preston at the Bull and Royal Hotel, and that's a famous hotel for a start, because not only did Judge Jeffreys stay there, Bonnie Prince Charlie did, Charles Dickens stayed there, and Judge Jeffreys stopped at the Bull Hotel, which is now the Bull and Royal. And during those times, if a town or a borough, like St Anne's, anywhere, Preston, if they needed a trading charter, it was normally left to the whim of the reigning monarch to grant it. And in 1684, Preston needed a trading charter. But they knew that Charles II, the king, might not grant it because of the bitter memories he might have had from about 40 years before during the English Civil War, when you had the parliamentarians fighting the royalists in the Civil War, Cromwell and all the rest of it, and all this resulted, which I'm sure we all know, after 1648, that one of the last battles was the Battle of Preston, 1648, and then, as I'm sure we all know, in 1649, Charles I was beheaded at Whitehall. That brought in a republic, and that brought in Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector of England. So Charles I was beheaded. In other words, Charles II's dad. So he knew all this, and Preston Corporation knew that Charles II might not grant this trading charter that Preston needed in 1684. So what Preston Corporation did, they hatched a cunning plan. They knew that Judge Jeffreys, he had influence with Charles II, and also Judge Jeffreys' mother was from Lancashire. Judge Jeffreys' mother was from Lancashire. So what they did, they decided to put on a grand dinner, a banquet, in honour of Judge Jeffreys, because of his visits to the town. And while they were having that dinner, they'd ask him for the favour about that trading charter, 1684. So they put this massive dinner on, and they asked him for that favour about getting the royal charter. And then a few weeks after that grand dinner, Judge Jeffreys wrote back to Preston Corporation, thanking them for a fine dinner, and said, by the way, your trading charter is granted. That letter, signed by the dreaded Judge Jeffreys, the hanging judge, is still in Preston archives to this very day. Signed by Judge Jeffreys. But the year after that, in 1685, during the unsuccessful Monmouth Rebellion, this is how Judge Jeffreys got his name as the hanging judge. 1,300 people were involved in that rebellion, and Judge Jeffreys presided over the courts. He presided over the courts, and it finished up, he hanged and executed over 300 people and sent over 1,200 people, 1,100 people to the colonies as slaves. And that's how he got his reputation as the hanging judge. And that was known as the Bloody Assizes, through that Monmouth Rebellion. So he was the judge who presided over that and hanged all them people and sent them all out as slaves. That's where he got his reputation. But even he fell out of favour when a bit later on William of Orange came to power, and Judge Jeffreys did something to upset the monarchy, so he finished up in the Tower himself. Judge Jeffreys, after being the Lord Chief Justice of England during Charles II's reign, finished up in the Tower himself, waiting trial. But Judge Jeffreys died in prison before he could be brought to any trial. But it's the golden nuggets like this that make it into history so important and so interesting, because a notorious character like Judge Jeffreys is linked to Preston and the northwest here because he always presided over the courts in Lancaster. And that's what makes history so good, because no matter what age you dip into, you're never disappointed at the golden nuggets that you can find in every historical period. This is why you've got specialists now. Specialists in the Greek history, specialists in Roman history. You've got the Viking historians, Saxon historians, Tudor historians, Elizabethan historians, you name it, there's a specialist. And now, in this day and age, ancient history is very, very popular. The study of paleontology. Paleontology, the study of dinosaurs, bones and old fossils. It's now big business. Films like Jurassic Park have helped to bring alive creatures that's been extinct for 65 million years. Has anybody ever seen Jurassic Park? Yeah. Most people have seen those films. The first one was one of the best. Computer-generated effects make them look so real. Wouldn't it be great if you could really do what it did in that film and bring one of these prehistoric creatures back to life? Wouldn't it be great if you could do it? These that's been extinct for 65 million years. Wouldn't it be great if you could bring a T-Rex back and see it running around the streets of St Anne's?
Apparently Adolf Hitler did try to bring back the dinosaurs and use them against the Allies in World War II.
I've heard that.
Yeah.
I have heard that. That's another tale for another time. But wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great if you could bring a T-Rex back to life, just like in that film, and have it running around the streets around here? Would that be good? Would that be good or not? I think it'd be fantastic. Eh? I think it'd be fantastic. Do you know there's people now, there's historians now who study creatures that were alive before the dinosaurs. They study creatures that were around before the dinosaurs. And the beauty of it is, you don't need films like Jurassic Park to bring them all alive, because they are all around us. They're still alive to this very day.
They're saying the T-Rex was actually covered in feathers, not scales.
Oh, I've heard that and all. I've heard that. Sorry?
Vegetarian clause in it.
Sorry?
A vegetarian clause.
Yeah, T-Rex was a vegetarian.
I've heard all the tales. I've heard all the tales, but I would love to see one. I would love to see one. But the thing is, the beauty of it is, that's just a film. Generated effects. But the point being, talk after. Point being, the people who study the creatures that were alive before the dinosaurs, that's the beauty of it. And you don't need the films like Jurassic Park to bring them alive, because they're all around us. They're still living to this day. And if you've been following this talk, like I know you have, you'll know what they are, because we've talked about them already. What am I talking about?
Seagulls.
Not seagulls.
How many human beings could
The cockroach. The cockroach. We've mentioned it already in that film with Steve McQueen. Papillon, when he's breaking the cockroaches up into his mug of water to make insect soup. Cockroaches still alive after being around before the dinosaurs. The most loathed creature on earth, the scuttling stuff of nightmares. But a cockroach, believe it or not, is one of nature's wonder survivors. One of nature's great creatures, far more reliable and far more resourceful than the dinosaurs. In 1978, when I stepped ashore in Mombasa off the cargo ship The Custodian, I knew something was afoot. As I walked down the gangway onto the dock, it was more like something was under my foot. It was like treading on eggshells, because I knew what I was stepping on when I stood on the dock side. It was me standing on and crushing cockroaches. They were all over the place. Because I was in the Merchant Navy in the 70s, and I worked for Harrison Line of Liverpool, and in 1978 we went to East Africa, and we arrived around Mombasa, and we had to queue up because all the ships were queuing up to go alongside. We anchored off, and for about 3 weeks we had to wait, and eventually we went in alongside in Mombasa. I was in the engine room bringing the ship alongside, and when we docked in Mombasa it was about 20 to 7 in the morning. We docked the ship and I came up, and it was a lovely sunny day, and I leaned against the ship's rail and I watched all the Kenyans unloading the ship. Fascinating it was that particular morning. Lovely sunny day, it was going to be scorching. Watched all the Kenyans unload the ship. And I remember as I was stood there with all my colleagues from the engine room, I noticed a big dark shape, and I thought where the sun was, that looked like a funny type of shadow, when the shadow should have been, say, over here. And all of a sudden that dark shape moved. And I soon realised what it was thousands of cockroaches on the move. They were all over the place, and they were on the ship, especially in my cabin. I soon learnt the golden rule when you join the Merchant Navy. I used to work in the engine room. I used to put on a white boiler suit, and then every morning, if I was on the morning shift, I put my boots on. But first, you give them a quick shake, because you could always guarantee there'd be half a dozen of these creepy crawlies come running out, scuttling over the cabin floor and vanishing into the nooks and crannies. I used to tell people when I got home, and people used to be horrified. They said, "Brian, how could you stand it?" How could I stand it? We shouldn't be horrified by cockroaches. We should be mesmerised. A cockroach, the cockroach has been around for 400 million years. Long before the dinosaurs came lumbering along. Long before. Remarkable creatures. Here in Britain, we only have these, inch long, inch and a half ones, browny black ones. But in some parts of South America where I've been, they grow to over 4 inches long. And when you think of the prehistoric age, everything was 10 times as big. So that lovable little cockroach would be about 1.5 foot long. Can you imagine that? About 1.5 foot long. But even though our cockroaches that we have, these little small ones, fantastic ability. A cockroach can run 3 feet every second, which is equivalent to an elephant running 200 miles an hour. They can twist and turn 25 times a second. And the key to this is breathing. A cockroach breathes through holes in its body, down the left and right side. And that's why it can move so quick, 25 times a second. A gymnast, in comparison, is moving with the agility of a shire horse. That's how good a cockroach is. They have super skills. A cockroach can see in total darkness because of the long antennae that come out of the head. At the end of the antennae, there's 2 little holes they use for smelling. So a cockroach doesn't need any eyes and doesn't need a nose. Unbelievable. And they do travel around on ships. And because they travel around on ships, the sailors, and they have a girl in every port. A cockroach has a girl in every port. A male cockroach can have between 5 and 6 wives. And each wife gives birth to between 300 and 700 young to one father. They're very prolific. So in other words, a cockroach lives life like an ancient pharaoh. Big king with plenty of children. Yet people say, we hate cockroaches, we don't like them. Pirates didn't hate cockroaches, pirates loved them. Does anybody know why pirates love cockroaches? No, they didn't eat them or make soup. They made other people eat them. Insubordinate ship's crews, insubordinate ship's officers, captured prisoners. A common pirate punishment was eating live cockroaches. On the wooden ships, there were big uns. And in the tropics, thousands of them on these old wooden ships. So the unfortunate prisoner had to eat a few of these cockroaches in a bowl, live cockroaches, these big uns. It must have been like eating a bowl of cornflakes without the milk. Oh, is that horrible? Is that horrible? Who thinks it's horrible? But you've all eaten cockroaches. You've all eaten cockroaches. Cockroaches are found in cocoa beans. And when the cocoa beans are crushed to make chocolate, the crushed roaches get into the mix. I drink hot chocolate every night. Well, I used to. Think of the protein. We use cockroach blood to colour our food, don't we? Cochineal. Cochineal. In Peru, they breed a special type of cactus to breed cockroaches to get cochineal, to colour our food. Unbelievable. How did we arrive at that one? And when we talk about food, cockroaches love a good dinner. And cockroaches never suffer from famine because a cockroach can eat anything. They can eat any old rubbish. They can eat rotting plants, leaves, dead cockroaches. If a cockroach dies, they don't bury it, they eat it. Waste not, want not. They can eat anything, can a cockroach. They can eat paper, cardboard, wood, leather and plastic. You name it, a cockroach can eat it. And if they can't find water to drink, to wash it down, they can even drink ink out of your fountain pen. That's how fantastic a cockroach is. And with this fantastic nourishment that a cockroach feeds itself and drinks, with this fantastic nourishment, a cockroach has developed one of the finest digestive systems in the animal world. Another little fact about cockroaches. A cockroach breaks wind every 15 minutes. Just like some people I know. They never suffer from constipation, are regular as clockwork. And people say, we don't like them. They don't like, they're dirty, they give us diseases, they're dirty, they spread diseases. It's not their fault. Because when we human beings see a cockroach, we want to stand on it and kill it. So they're forced underground, into the drains and sewers. So it's our fault, not a cockroach's fault. We forced them into the drains and sewers. So when they come up, they might pass on disease. Because I'll tell you something else about a cockroach, one of the cleanest insects in the animal world. A cockroach is squeaky clean. It has an outer shell, as you've seen. I've seen tons of cockroaches. They have a shell, a carapace on the back, don't they? Have you seen them? A carapace. Living on that carapace are little mites that travel round on the cockroach's back. So they travel round just like on a shower trip to Blackpool. All these mites travel round on the back of the cockroach. And when those little mites give birth to the baby mites, all the baby mites gather round the cockroach's mouth to feed on all the rubbish that cockroaches have left when it's had its evening dinner, leaving the cockroach's mouth squeaky clean as if it's brushed its teeth in Colgate. So in other words, a cockroach, that people don't realise, is one of the cleanest insects around. So when next time you see a cockroach, give it a chance. It only lives 12 months, so let it live a bit. If I only knew what I knew in 1978, I would have trod more carefully. Trod more carefully. But you know, if there was a nuclear war, we'd all die. Because of the fallout, a cockroach wouldn't, it would survive. Yet we can kill one just like that, standing on it. But a cockroach would adapt to the situation and learn to live amongst all that fallout where we'd all die. A cockroach would survive. Unbelievable when you think about it. Unbelievable. And we started this talk talking about the great cultures like the Greeks and the Romans. Call them what you will. Yeah, we talked about it at break. They had the faults, but they were known as great cultures. The Greeks, the Romans, the Egyptians, and all the rest of it. And the Bible's a great book. The Bible's a great book. Got many stories in that. This is a great book. 2,400 years old, this book. The Histories by Herodotus. Has anybody ever heard of it? I can't believe the knowledge I'm giving you lot tonight. I just can't believe it. The Histories by Herodotus. That's a great book. Herodotus was born in 490 BC at the start of the Greek Wars. The start of the Greek Wars. He was born in Halikarnassus, Southwest Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. The 9 books that make up this, the Histories, the 9 books that make up this book, is all about the Greek and Persian Wars. That started in 490 and lasted 11 years, to about 479. About 479. And the result of the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians, which I'm sure most people know, was Greece's liberation from the Persian threat. In other words, this small Mediterranean country, against all the odds, defeated the mighty Persian Empire. The mighty Persian Empire. So this book is full of great stories, just like the Armada, Trafalgar, the Battle of Britain, and the wars at the backdrop of the book. But the aim of Herodotus, who wrote that book that's 2,400 years old, the aim of Herodotus was to ensure for all mankind that great human achievement would never be forgotten. So what Herodotus did, he toured around the Mediterranean, interviewing all the people who remember how the war started in the first place. And while he was at it, he noted down all the local habits and customs of the local people. So this book is full of rich and wonderful stories of the people who lived all that time ago. This book tells you how to catch a crocodile. And what you do, you get a pig, you drag it to the water's edge, where the river is, you beat it with a stick until it squeals, The crocodile in the water hears the noise and thinks dinner's being served, so it waddles up to the beach. You have a man standing by with a bucket of mud, and when the crocodile appears, he scoops out the mud, puts it in the crocodile's eyes, and when the crocodile can't see, he stabs it with a knife. It tells you in that book. So that's how to catch and kill a crocodile, in that book. It tells you in this book how the ancient Babylonians marry off their young women. And what the ancient Babylonians do, they gather up all the young women when they're 18, and they auction off the beauties to the highest bidder. Auction off the beauties to the highest bidder. And the money they've made, they put to one side. And then they auction off the less attractive girls, and if they fail to raise a bid, they use the money from the beauties to act as a cash dowry to get rid of the ugly women. It's in that book. It also tells you how the Persians, how the ancient Persians retake drunk all the decisions they made when they were sober. And that's a great idea. If ever I've heard an idea, that's a great one. It tells you how the Egyptian women urinate standing up while the Egyptian men urinate squatting down. It's in this book. It tells you about the Gindanese tribe whose women wear a leather band around their ankles which indicates the number of lovers she's had. So each woman puts on a rubber band or a leather band around her ankle every time she's made love to a fella. So the woman with the greatest number of bands round her ankles enjoys the biggest reputation because she's been loved by the greatest number of men. That's in that book. It tells you how the ancient Scythians gild the skulls of their enemies and use them as drinking vessels. All that is in that book. All that is in that book. Fantastic book. This book inspired the English film, The English Patient. Have you ever seen that film? Oscar-winning film, The English Patient. Kristen Scott Thomas and Ralph Fiennes. If you watch that film next time it's on, I watch it every time it's on. This book is in that film. Ralph Fiennes carries it round with him. And because of that film, this book that never sold for donkey's years became $1 million bestseller. It became the in thing to walk around with that book. I've got 2 copies. I'll not go into why I've got 2 copies, but I've got 2 copies. The histories became the in thing to carry that book. Fantastic. I heard what, so in other words, from the Greek world, you've got all sorts of sources. That's one of the finest books you can get. The histories, you can buy it anywhere. On the internet, dirt cheap now. That cost about £9 when I bought it, when I was studying the ancient world. Buy it for next to nothing now. The histories. Great book. So we've got all these great cultures. I once heard somebody say, the Greeks and Romans, the Persians, the Egyptians, fabulous cultures, while we were scratching around in mud huts. That's not true, is it? No. You only need to look at Stonehenge. When I first saw Stonehenge, when I was just a little lad in a school book, I thought there was nothing to it, until I actually went to see it and realised what a fabulous monument it was. Fabulous monument. Because when you imagine an ancient tribe who would drag stones miles across hilly country, the size of a bus weighing 40 tonnes, stand them up in the ground, go and get loads more boulders the size of stretched limos, more boulders, put lintels on and make a fabulous monument, and then stand back and wait 4,000 years and watch the puzzlement on modern people's faces as we all scratch our heads and go, how did they do that? What's it all for? I'm not bothered why Stonehenge was built, what the reasons were. I can't give a monkey's. It's the fact that we could build it that fascinates me, that we had that fantastic culture that could build those monuments, irrespective of the reasons. And I know that people have done talks here on Stonehenge and all the monuments. You can speculate all day on the reasons. I'm only bothered with the fact that ancient man here could build those monuments. I've been all around England, Scotland, Wales, the Orkneys, Shetland, looking at these great monuments. What an astonishing race we were all those years ago, the old races here in Britain. Fantastic. When we talked about the Romans before, at school we were taught about Queen Boadicea. Does that ring any bells? We all taught about Queen Boadicea, who tried to kick the Romans out of Britain, AD 61, and she almost succeeded. We were all taught that at school. Yet there again, that wasn't a name, Boadicea. That was a name the Victorians give her. Her real name was either Buda or Boudica, and she wasn't even a queen. But that's another story altogether. But the woman who was the queen lived here in the north. Anybody know who the queen was? The first queen to rule Britain. Any ideas? Queen Cartimandua was the first woman to rule Britain. She ruled for 27 years. And she was a northern woman. She lived here in the north. She ruled for 27 years, from 43 AD with Claudius. And then she was defeated in battle in AD 69, defeated by her ex-husband, King Venutius. She was far more important than Boudica ever was. Far more important. I'll tell you another little snippet. I know we have to finish in 5 minutes. Time's rolling on. I'll tell you another one. So Queen Cartimandua. What a fabulous queen. The reason why she wasn't taught in schools, there's a very good reason for that, but we haven't time to go into it. That's another story another time. Queen Cartimandua. Another misnomer. Pirates and buccaneers. The number of times people say a buccaneer's a pirate and a pirate's a buccaneer. Does anybody believe that? That's wrong. A buccaneer is not a pirate, and a pirate wasn't a buccaneer either. Henry Morgan was king of the buccaneers. King of the buccaneers. Somebody once called him a pirate. He sued for damages, and they had to pay out. He won his claim because Henry Morgan was a buccaneer, not a pirate. Francis Drake, one of the great seamen of the British history, ransacked the Spanish Main for 30 years. He spent 30 years bringing back the gold back to the English coffers for the English crown. To the Spanish, he was called a pirate. They called him El Dragon. They wanted him brought to justice. Francis Drake couldn't be brought to justice. He was legalised to go and attack the Spanish ships. He was a privateer. He got letters of authorisation, letters of marque, to allow him to go and rob the Spanish ships and bring back the gold for the English coffers. The Spanish called him a pirate. What cheek the Spaniards have. They complained when Drake was robbing the ships of their gold, which they'd nicked from the Aztecs and the Incas. So they were nicking all that gold, then complained when Drake nicked it off them. That's a great book. Daniel Defoe's Adventure of Robinson Crusoe. Anybody read it? You must have all read that at school. Been going since school days. What? People call this the first adventure novel written in the 1700s. Some people say that was the very first adventure novel because fiction was just a non-entity in the early 1700s. Never been done. Daniel Defoe wrote that book and people call it the first novel. It's not really a novel because it's based on a true event. Because there was a man who was the real Robinson Crusoe, a Scottish sailor called Alexander Selkirk. He was the real Robinson Crusoe. And Daniel Defoe, the genius that he was, he bought the Selkirk story in 1712 from Selkirk, who related his adventures, and weaved a story around a real event. That was the genius of Daniel Defoe. All his books are based on real events. That's what Daniel, not many people realise that. Daniel Defoe, can talk about him all day, wrote stories around a real event. We talked about Buffalo Bill. We'll finish on this because time's going on. We can carry on another time. Buffalo Bill, Pony Express rider, mate of Tom Dobson's from Preston. Buffalo Bill was a Pony Express rider. Then he went on to be the real Buffalo Bill. Wild West shows all around. He was Buffalo Bill 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Putting on the Wild West shows, cowboys and Indians all around Europe, everywhere. The show was cowboys defeating the Indians. It was the native Indians who allowed him to do it because they were making money out of it. Otherwise, Buffalo Bill couldn't have done it because the Indians didn't like the cowboys beating the Indians. So it was the Indians who allowed Buffalo Bill to do it. He was doing the Buffalo Bill for years. And by the time he was 65, Buffalo Bill was worn out and in debt. And he was bankrupt by 1913 after making millions. And he died in 1917, the year after Thomas Dobson, ironically enough. And just a last snippet before we finish, Buffalo Bill's granddaughter went round the circuit, round the clubs, in a knife-throwing act. She was called Cordy and Loran. She went round the northern clubs, knife-throwing. All round, nobody ever realises that. She went round the clubs. She was a horse rider and knife thrower. On one particular night, a concert secretary got on her nerves that much, she got hold of a knife, threw it and pinned him to the stage door. That was Buffalo Bill's granddaughter. And people were up in arms about this and they complained and they said, "You nearly killed that club steward." She said, "No way was he in danger of being killed. If I'd have wanted to kill him, pal, I'd have killed him. I meant to miss." And she did because she was a knife thrower. Buffalo Bill's granddaughter, oh, what a woman. She could drink any man under the table and she'd swear like a trooper. And she went round the club circuit for donkey's years as a knife throwing act. We better call it a day there because we'll go on all night if we're not careful. That just about does it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming out on a warm night when World Cup's on. And I hope you've learnt something. I hope you found it entertaining. And all I can say is I'll see you on another talk at some future time. Thank you very much indeed.